I never thought survival would feel like slow drowning, but that is how inflation taught me to breathe. My alarm rang at 5, and I told myself, "Get up. You owe tomorrow another hour." Emily mumbled, "You're leaving again?" I said, "Just one more shift, Em. Things will get better." She didn't answer. Her silence followed me out the door. At lunch, Ryan laughed and said, "Bro, you're working like the rent is chasing you." I shrugged and said, "It kind of is." He leaned closer. "You're losing weight. You okay?" I said, "Love means pushing through." Ryan frowned. "Love also means being present." I waved him off. "This is temporary. Love will wait." Mr. Collins slammed a folder on my desk and said, "I need overtime tonight." I asked, "Can it wait?" "I have plans." He stared. "Inflation doesn't wait, and neither does this company." I nodded. "I'll stay." He smiled like he won something. I texted Emily, running late again. She replied, "Okay." One word. I stared at it longer than I should. I typed, "Dinner tomorrow." She sent, "We'll see." My chest tightened, but I told myself stress changes people, not love. That night, Ryan called. "You missed poker." I said, "I missed rent if I don't work." He sighed. "Just don't miss your life." I laughed it off. "You worry too much." He said, "Someone has to." On Saturday, Emily said, "Do you even live here anymore?" I kissed her forehead. "I'm doing this for us." She pulled back. "I didn't ask for this." I said, "You'll thank me later." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. At work, Mr. Collins said, "You're reliable." I said, "I try." He replied, "People like you survive." I felt proud. I ignored the missed calls buzzing in my pocket. I told myself, Real, men choose responsibility. That evening, Emily called again. I answered, "Hey, I'm almost done." She said softly, "You always are." I said, "Please understand." She whispered, "I'm tired of understanding." The line went dead. Ryan texted, "Go home." Mr. Collins walked by and asked, "You free tonight?" I thought of the bills, the groceries, the future. I said, "Yeah, I can stay." I texted Emily, "Another late shift." She didn't reply. I stood under the buzzing lights and told myself sacrifice proves loyalty. I believed love was patient enough to wait. I didn't know I was already choosing work over goodbye. I whispered, "Just a few more months," like a prayer nobody answered. At break, Ryan messaged she sounded sad. I replied, "She'll understand." He wrote, "You keep saying that." I didn't respond. Mr. Collins passed again and said, "You're saving this department." I forced a smile. "I'm just doing my job." He said, "That's how men survive." Those words settled heavy in my chest. When I finally got home, near midnight, Emily sat awake. "You promised dinner," she said. I dropped my bag. "I'm sorry." She asked, "Do you even miss me?" I said, "Every day." She laughed softly. "Then why am I alone?" I had no answer. She turned away and said, "I waited." I said, "I'm still trying." She whispered, "So am I." The room felt smaller. I checked my phone instead of her face. In bed, she asked, "If I left, would you notice?" I said, "Don't joke." She said, "I'm not." I rolled over. "Please, Emily, not tonight." She went quiet again. I stared at the ceiling and told myself tomorrow would fix everything. I told myself love understood sacrifice. I told myself working harder meant loving harder. I didn't see the distance growing. I only saw the numbers adding up. My phone buzzed once more. Mr. Collins wrote, "Early shift tomorrow." I typed, "I'll be there." Emily didn't move. I closed my eyes and believed I was doing the right thing, even as something fragile slipped away. Outside, the city hummed. I promised myself rest would come later. I promised love would wait longer. I slept with my uniform ready, not knowing I was already late. That choice felt responsible, safe, and necessary. It was also the first quiet step toward losing her. I smiled in the dark and told myself sacrifice was love. I didn't know love was already packing. I chose the shift. I chose wrong. And I called it loyalty. The clock kept ticking. So did my mistake. I didn't hear it break. Not yet. But it would. Very soon. I was sure. I was wrong. Completely. Alone. My phone buzzed at work, and Mr. Collins said, "Shift's canceled. Go home." I blinked. "Seriously?" He shrugged. "Budget cuts." I grabbed my jacket and thought, maybe this is a sign. I texted Emily, coming home early. No reply. I smiled anyway and said to myself, I'll surprise her. On the walk home, I remembered Emily laughing in the kitchen, her arms around my waist. I whispered, she'll be happy. A woman passed me, talking about groceries, and I muttered, soon, things will be easier. I reached our building and felt light for the first time in months. I unlocked the door and froze. I heard laughter. Not mine. A man's voice said, "You're trouble." Emily laughed softly and said, "You like it?" My heart thumped. I stepped inside and said, "Emily." The laughter stopped. I walked toward the bedroom. Every step felt slow. I pushed the door open and saw her on the bed with Daniel. He looked relaxed. She looked caught, not shocked. I said, "What is this?" My voice didn't sound like mine. Emily sighed and said, "I didn't plan this." Daniel smirked and said, "Man, you weren't supposed to be home." I stared at him. "You're Daniel, the co-worker." He nodded. "Yeah, they're just a friend." I laughed once, sharp and broken. "So this is why you stopped calling." Emily rubbed her face. I felt alone. I said, "I work for us." She said, "You worked away from me." Daniel leaned back and said, "She needed someone present." I snapped, "Shut up." He raised his hands. "Relax. I'm just being honest." I looked at Emily. "How long?" She hesitated. "A few weeks." I asked, in my bed. She whispered, "Yes." My chest burned. I said, "Did you ever plan to tell me?" She shook her head. I didn't know how. Daniel said, "Look, man, it just happened." I said, "You planned it." He shrugged. "You weren't around." I waited for tears, apologies, anything. Emily just looked tired. I said, "Do you love him?" She didn't answer. Daniel smiled like he won. That smile hurt more than her silence. I stepped back and said, "Get dressed." Daniel asked, "You want me to leave?" I said, "I'm leaving." Emily said, "Please don't go like this." I replied, "Like what?" "A fool." She whispered, "I never meant to hurt you." I grabbed my keys. Daniel said, "No hard feelings?" I turned and said, "You took something that wasn't yours." He laughed. "People aren't property." I said, "You're trash." He stopped smiling. Emily followed me to the door and said, "Where will you go?" I said, "Anywhere but here." She cried softly. "I waited for you." I said, "I worked for you." She said, "I needed you." I said, "You replaced me." The door closed behind me. The hallway felt colder. I leaned against the wall and breathed hard. I heard Daniel laughing again inside. That sound cut deep. Outside, the city lights blurred. I called Ryan. He answered, "What's wrong?" I said, "She cheated." He swore. "Where are you?" I said, "Walking." He said, "Come here." I kept walking. My phone buzzed. Emily texted, "I'm sorry." I deleted it. Another message came. "Please talk to me." I turned my phone off. I sat on a bench and whispered, "I did everything right." No one answered. Cars passed. People laughed. Life kept moving. That night, something split inside me. The man who believed in waiting stayed in that apartment. The man who walked away carried shame heavier than anger. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I just left. And nothing was ever the same after that. Not me. Not love. Not home. Everything broke quietly. Right there. In silence. Forever. I packed my clothes without noise. Ryan watched and said, "You don't have to rush." I said, "I just don't want to think." He nodded. "Couch is yours." I slept there that night, staring at the ceiling, hearing Emily's voice in my head saying, I felt alone. In the morning, my phone buzzed. Emily texted, "I never meant for it to happen." I didn't reply. Another message came. "You chose work over me." I whispered, "I chose us." I turned the phone face down. Ryan poured coffee and said, "You should talk." I said, "There's nothing left." He said, "Silence eats people alive." I shrugged. "So does truth." He sighed. "You're blaming yourself." I said, "I should have been home." He snapped. "She still made a choice." At work, Mr. Collins stared at my screen and said, "You missed a deadline." I said, "I'll fix it." He replied, "This isn't like you." I said, "I know." He crossed his arms. "Get your head straight, or you're done." I nodded, feeling hollow. During lunch, Emily texted again. "Can we talk?" I typed, "What would that change?" Then I deleted it. Ryan messaged, "You okay?" I replied, breathing. He sent, "Barely counts." That evening, Ryan dragged me to a cafe and said, "Eat something." A woman behind the counter smiled and said, "Rough day?" I said, "Long life." She laughed softly. "I'm Lisa." I said, "I'm tired." She slid a coffee over. "On the house." I sat there quiet. Lisa said, "You don't have to talk." I said, "Everyone keeps telling me to." She replied, "Silence can be safer." I looked at her. "It hurts more." She nodded. "It usually does." My phone buzzed again. Emily wrote, "I miss you." Lisa noticed my face and asked, "Someone you loved?" I said, "Someone I trusted." She said, "That's harder." I whispered, "I keep thinking it's my fault." Lisa said, "Fault isn't the same as responsibility." Ryan joined us and said, "He's stubborn." I said, "You're loud." Lisa smiled. "Balance." Ryan asked, "You gonna reply?" I shook my head. "If I open that door, I fall apart." At work the next day, Mr. Collins said, "You're slipping." I said, "I know." He replied, "Fix it." I wanted to scream, "My life is broken," but I said, "I will." When I sat down, my hands shook. That night, Emily sent voice notes. I was lonely. I didn't feel chosen. I needed comfort. I listened once. I didn't again. I said out loud, I was trying. The room stayed quiet. Ryan said, "You're allowed to be angry." I said, "I'm also guilty." He asked for what? I said, "Not being enough." He shook his head. "You were there. Just tired." I laughed bitterly. Apparently, tired isn't lovable. At the cafe, Lisa asked, "Do you want revenge?" I said, "I want peace." She replied, "Those aren't the same." I said, "Forgiveness feels like losing." She said, "Sometimes it's choosing not to bleed longer." Emily sent one last text. "Please say something." I stared at it. My fingers hovered. I didn't type. The silence screamed louder than any fight we had. Ryan said, "You can't live in maybe." I said, "I don't know where to stand." He said, "Stand where you hurt least." I whispered, "That place doesn't exist." Lisa handed me a napkin and said, "You're allowed to rest." I asked, "From loving?" She said, "From blaming yourself." I folded the napkin and held it tight. That night, on the couch, I realized betrayal isn't always cruel. Sometimes it's weak, quiet, and selfish. The silence between me and Emily hurt more than her confession ever could. I asked myself, do I want revenge, or do I want to breathe again? The answer didn't come. Only silence did, and it stayed. I agreed to meet Emily because silence was rotting me. She texted, "Just coffee." I replied, "1 hour." When I arrived, she was already there. She stood up and smiled. "You look tired." I said, "You look different." She laughed. "I feel lighter." We sat down. She crossed her legs and said, "I didn't want this to be awkward." I replied, "It already is." She sighed. "I needed closure." I said, "So did I." She stirred her drink and said, "I didn't mean to hurt you." I asked, "Did you think about me at all?" She looked away and said, "Daniel understands my needs." I felt my throat tighten. "Your needs?" She nodded. "He's stable. He earns more. He's present." I whispered, "I was trying." She said, "Trying isn't the same as being there." I almost said sorry. I almost said I'd do better. My mouth opened and my chest burned. I asked, "So this is about money?" She shrugged. "It's about security." I laughed quietly. "I worked myself sick for that." She replied, and I was alone. I said, "Did you ever love me?" She paused too long. "I did." I asked, past tense. She didn't answer. That silence hit harder than her words. She leaned forward and said, "I hoped we could stay friends." I shook my head. "You replaced me." She replied, "I moved on." I said, "While I was working." She said, "You chose that." I said, "I chose us." She said, "You chose absence." I felt small. I almost begged. I almost said, "Give me another chance." Then Daniel walked in. He checked his watch and said, "Sorry I'm late." He looked at me and said, "Oh, you're still here." Emily smiled at him. That smile wasn't for me. Daniel sat and said, "You okay?" She said, "Yeah." He looked at me and said, "So, this is done?" I said, "You're rude." He shrugged. "I'm honest." I stood up. My hand shook. I said, "Did you enjoy taking my place?" He smiled. Someone had to fill the gap. Emily said, "Please don't fight." I laughed bitterly. "Don't worry. I won't beg." Daniel said, "No hard feelings?" I looked at Emily. "Is this what you wanted?" She said softly, "I wanted peace." I replied, "You wanted comfort." Daniel smirked. "Same thing." I said no. Comfort costs less. Emily said, "You're being unfair." I asked, "Am I?" She looked relieved, not guilty. That was the truth I needed. She wasn't sorry. She was free. I said, "I thought losing you broke me." Daniel checked his phone. "We're late." Emily stood and said, "I hope you heal." I said, "I hope you remember." She frowned. "Remember what?" I said, "Who carried you when you couldn't walk?" Daniel laughed. "Drama." I looked at him and said, "Enjoy the wait." He rolled his eyes. Emily reached out. "Please don't hate me." I said, "I don't hate you." She whispered, "Then what?" I answered, "I'm done." I walked away. No shouting. No tears. My heart felt cracked, but my head felt clear. Outside, I breathed deep and said, "I didn't lose her." The word surprised me. That night, Ryan asked, "How did it go?" I said, "I almost begged." He asked, "But?" I said, "Then I saw the truth." He said, "Which is?" I replied, "She didn't choose him. She chose ease." I lay on the couch and whispered, "I won't beg for love again." The room stayed quiet, but for once, the silence felt honest. I slept knowing dignity hurt less than desperation. And that was enough. I woke up on Ryan's couch and said, "I can't do that job anymore." He blinked and said, "You mean complain?" I said, "No. Quit." He smiled. "About time." I said, "I'm scared." He replied, "Good. That means you're alive." At work, I told Mr. Collins, "I'm done." He laughed. "You'll be back." I said, "No, I won't." He leaned forward. "You need this place." I shook my head. "This place needs me more." I walked out before my hands could shake. Ryan handed me his laptop and said, "I found some freelance gigs." I said, "I don't know if I'm ready." He replied, "You weren't ready for betrayal either." I sighed. "Fair." He grinned. "Send the email." At the cafe, Lisa asked, "You look lighter." I said, "I quit." She raised her eyebrows. "Brave or reckless?" I smiled. "Both." She slid me coffee and said, "I believe in reckless hope." I laughed. I could use some. Days passed. Ryan asked, "How's the work?" I said, "Slow." He replied, "Slow isn't failure." Lisa said, "Eat." I said, "I'm not hungry." She said, "Your body disagrees." I ate. One afternoon, Ryan said, "You hear about Daniel?" I said, "No." He leaned back. "Fired. Office misconduct." I paused. "With Emily?" He nodded. "Rumor says yes." I felt nothing. That surprised me. Lisa watched my face and asked, "Satisfaction?" I shook my head. "Just distance." She smiled. "That's growth." I said, "I thought I'd feel something." She replied, "Peace doesn't shout." My phone buzzed. Emily texted, "Can we talk?" I stared. Ryan asked, "You answering?" I said, "No." He said, "You're sure?" I nodded. Some doors closed quietly. Lisa said, "That's okay." Another message came. "Things are hard." I whispered, "They were hard before." I didn't send it. Ryan said, "You don't owe her closure." I said, "I know." My chest felt calm. Weeks passed. I slept better. Lisa said, "You stopped grinding your teeth." I said, "I stopped blaming myself." She replied, "That's louder than revenge." I nodded. Ryan clapped my shoulder and said, "You're standing straighter." I said, "I don't feel hunted anymore." He laughed. "That job was killing you." I replied, "I let it." At the cafe, Lisa asked, "Do you miss her?" I thought and said, "I miss who I was before I doubted myself." She smiled. "You're closer to him now." I said, "I think so." Ryan said, "Karma's funny." I replied, "Karma's patient." He raised his cup. "To patience." I raised mine. "To peace." Emily texted again. "I made a mistake." I deleted it. Lisa said softly, "You don't look angry." I said, "I'm not." She asked, "Then what?" I answered, "Done." That night, I lay on the couch and said out loud, "I'm okay." Ryan called from his room. Good. The city hummed outside. I didn't feel chased. I realized I didn't want revenge. I wanted rest. I wanted quiet mornings and honest work. I wanted myself back. Karma didn't announce itself. It just unfolded. Daniel fell. Emily struggled. I kept walking. For the first time, my sleep wasn't heavy. It was clean. I closed my eyes without regret. And nothing followed me into the dark. The knock came late. Ryan looked at me and said, "You expecting someone?" I said, "No." The knock came again, softer this time. I stood up and said, "I'll check." When I opened the door, Emily stood there. Her eyes were red. Her hand shook. She said hi. I didn't invite her in. I said, "What do you want?" She swallowed. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside. 5 minutes. She walked in slowly, like the room might reject her. She looked smaller, tired. She said, "Daniel's gone." I nodded. I heard. She blinked. "You don't ask why?" I said, "I don't need to." She sat on the edge of the chair and whispered, "When things got hard, he left." Ryan stayed silent in the kitchen. Emily looked at me and said, "I was wrong." I crossed my arms. "You already knew that." She cried quietly. I thought love was comfort. I replied, "Love shows up." She nodded. "You always did." She wiped her face and said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." She looked surprised. "That's it." I said, "I forgave you." She leaned forward. "Then we can try again?" My chest stayed calm. "No." Her voice broke. "Why not?" I said, "Because forgiveness isn't a rewind." She whispered, "I've changed." I replied, "So have I." She said, "I miss you." I answered, "I miss who I was before I begged." She stood up and said, "I made a mistake." I said, "You made a choice." She cried harder. I didn't know it would hurt this much. I said, "I did." She asked, "Why are you so calm?" I said, "Because I already mourned us." Ryan cleared his throat and left the room. Emily said, "I don't have anyone." I replied, "You had me." She said, "I was scared." I said, "So was I." She reached for my hand. I stepped back. She whispered, "Please." I said, "I won't beg anymore." She said, "I'm begging now." I replied, "And I'm listening." She looked confused. "Then why won't you stay?" I said, "Because staying would erase what I learned." She sat back down and said, "I thought you'd yell." I shook my head. "I don't need to." She said, "I deserve it." I answered, "Maybe, but I deserve peace." She asked, "Do you hate me?" I said, "No." She asked, "Do you love me?" I paused. "I care about you." She whispered, "That's not the same." I replied, "No, it's healthier." She wiped her tears and said, "I see it now." I said, "See what?" She answered, "What I lost." I nodded. "That's enough." She stood at the door and said, "I wish I had waited." I said, "I waited long enough." She opened the door slowly. "Take care of yourself." I replied, "I am." She hesitated. "Goodbye." I said, "Goodbye, Emily." The door closed without force. The sound was soft, final. Ryan came back and asked, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You sure?" I smiled. For the first time, I sat down and felt no anger. No victory. Just certainty. I realized closure doesn't scream. It whispers. That night, I slept without checking my phone. I didn't wait for another knock. I didn't replay old words. I forgave her. I didn't return. And that choice felt like freedom. The door stayed closed. So did the past. I breathed and moved on. Ryan walked into the living room and said, "Guess what?" I looked up from my laptop. "You finally cleaned your room?" He laughed. "I opened the business account." I smiled. "You did it." He nodded. "I'm terrified." I said, "That means it matters." I closed my laptop and said, "I landed another client." Ryan whistled. "Look at you." I shrugged. "It's steady now." He said, "You earned that." I replied, "I survived for it." At the cafe, Lisa asked, "How's work?" I said, "Busy." She smiled. "Good busy or bad busy?" I said, "The kind that lets me sleep." She laughed. "That's the best kind." She poured coffee and said, "You don't look hunted anymore." I said, "I stopped running." Ryan joined us and said, "He's humble now." I said, "I'm tired of proving things." Lisa looked at me and said, "To who?" I answered, "Everyone who confused exhaustion with love." Later, Ryan said, "Remember when you wanted revenge?" I said, "I wanted silence." He nodded. "You got it." I replied, "I earned it." He smiled. "Same thing." Lisa and I walked after closing. She said, "You're different." I asked, "Better?" She said, "Present." I like that word. I said, "I learned patience the hard way." She said, "The hard way sticks." I told her, "I don't want to rush anything." She nodded. "Neither do I." I said, "You're not a rebound." She smiled softly. "Good. I don't bounce." Ryan called later and said, "First client paid." I said, "Proud of you." He replied, "We're building something." I said, "Yeah." Slowly. He laughed. "You finally stopped sprinting." That night, I thought about Emily. Not with anger. Not with longing. Just memory. I said out loud, "I didn't lose." No one argued. Lisa texted, "You okay?" I replied, "Yeah." She wrote, "That sounded honest." I smiled. At work the next morning, I said to myself, "I choose balance." The words felt real. No manager yelled. No clock chased me. Ryan said, "You ever think about winning?" I said, "Winning what?" He replied, "The breakup." I shook my head. I chose growth. He nodded. "That lasts longer." Lisa asked, "Do you regret loving her?" I said, "No," she asked. "Even after everything?" I replied, "Pain taught me limits." She said, "And?" I said, "Limits protect love." I realized revenge would have kept me tied to the past. Survival cut the rope. I wasn't proud of scars, but I respected them. Ryan raised his glass and said, "To stability." I raised mine. "To peace." Lisa added, "To patience." I thought about inflation, long shifts, empty promises. I said, "Money didn't break me." Ryan said, "People tried." I replied, "They failed." Lisa asked, "What did you learn?" I said, "Love isn't proven by exhaustion." She smiled. "Say that again." I repeated it. Slower. I walked home and felt grounded. No need to check messages. No fear of silence. Just space to breathe. That night, I wrote goals instead of regrets. Ryan texted, "Proud of you." Lisa texted, "Sleep well." I did. I didn't win by revenge. I won by surviving. By choosing growth when victory looked louder. The past stayed quiet. The future didn't scare me. I rested. And for once, that was enough. I stood outside my old apartment building and Ryan asked, "You want to go in?" I said no. He nodded. "You look calm." I replied, "I am." The windows didn't pull me anymore. The door didn't haunt me. Lisa walked beside me and said, "This place doesn't hurt you." I said, "It doesn't hold me either." She smiled. "That's freedom." I breathed deep and said, "I used to think silence meant failure." She replied, "Now?" I said, "Now it means peace." Ryan laughed and said, "Remember when you feared being alone?" I said, "I feared being unseen." He said, "You see yourself now." I nodded. That changed everything. I talk to myself as much as to anyone. I don't chase approval anymore. Lisa asked, "Do you miss it?" I said, "No. I don't borrow worth." She squeezed my hand. "You earned yours." I walked past the cafe window and saw my reflection. I said, "I look different." Ryan said, "You look steady." I replied, "I feel steady." That mattered more. I spoke out loud, like the city was listening. I once believed sacrifice meant love. Lisa said, "And now?" I said, "Love shouldn't cost your breath." Ryan snapped his fingers. "Say that louder." I smiled. "I don't need to." We sat on a bench, and I said, "I don't fear nights alone." Lisa asked why. I said, "Because I show up for myself." She nodded. "That's rare." Ryan said, "You never talk about winning anymore." I said, "I'm not keeping score." He laughed. "That's how you know you won." I shook my head. "That's how I know I'm done." I looked straight ahead and spoke like I was talking to you. "If you're listening, know this." Lisa glanced at me. I continued, "Losing someone doesn't mean losing yourself." Ryan stayed quiet. I said, "I worked myself empty and called it love." Lisa said, "You didn't know better." I replied, "I do now." Ryan said, "What changed?" I said, "I stopped confusing pain with proof." I passed the street where I used to rush home. I said, "I don't hurry anymore." Lisa asked, "Where are you going?" I answered, "Forward." She smiled. "That's enough." Ryan asked, "Any regrets?" I thought and said, "Only staying too long." He nodded. "That's human." I said, "I forgive myself." The words felt final. I stood up and said, I don't fear loneliness. Lisa said, you aren't lonely. I replied, exactly. Ryan laughed. Look at you. I spoke again, clear and steady. Betrayal didn't define me. Lisa said, you defined yourself. I said, through choice. Ryan said, through survival. I added, through growth. I stepped forward and felt lighter. No messages pulled me back. No memories begged. I said, I built this life. Lisa said, brick by brick. Ryan said, and you live in it. I turned once more and said, the man I became was worth the loss. Lisa nodded. Absolutely. Ryan said, without question. I didn't look back again. The future didn't roar. It waited. I walked toward it. Quiet. Certain. Free. I was done chasing. I was done breaking. I was finally home. In myself.